Hey Year 12s! In this video I'm going to walk you through what to do when you get a prompt for Imaginative Landscape. If Imaginative Landscape isn't your context, or you haven't yet watched our general video on the big ideas of this context, stop, go back to that first, then come back. For those of you still left, this video is relevant to you regardless of what text you study, or what type of piece you're writing. The process of identifying the key issues at play and deciding what to talk about is much the same between creative, persuasive, and expository. The prompt we'll be looking at is from the 2014 VCE end-of-year exam. If you want to use this as a practice exam, you might want to stop watching now. Keep in mind that what I'm about to tell you isn't the correct answer, because no such thing exists. It's a suggestion of how you could approach the topic. Alright, on to the prompt. Imagination shapes our response to the landscape. The first thing I'm going to try to do is work out what the prompt is asking. If you have a particularly complex prompt, this might mean rewriting it in a way that makes sense to you, but this one is pretty straightforward. Through the use of the word imagination, we can see that the starting point of this prompt is internal. The second thing we can see is that the statement response to the landscape is trying to get us to talk about the ways people interact with the world around them. It's important to realize at this stage that a high mark is dependent on dealing with all aspects of the prompt, not just one. This means looking at the point of intersection between these two topics and talking about it explicitly. Next, I'm going to start to draw out a plan for the different directions I might stretch this prompt in. How many you do and which you choose will depend on what writing style you're using, but a few possible ideas to consider expanding on with this prompt would be how we see the world is dependent on us as individuals. Imagination is a component of this. The imagined world contains our beliefs and values about the world, which we impose on what we see. How we respond to the physical world is somewhat reliant on this imaginative grounding. On one hand, we might manipulate a landscape to fit what we want it to be. On the other hand, we might find the landscape hostile if it proves unwieldy for our desires. In an interpretive sense, physical landscape is subject to the imagination of the viewer, and in a physical sense, it might be altered by the imagined aims of the viewer. Note that not all of these points are directly answering the prompt or agreeing with it. You can absolutely put forward ideas that do not agree with the prompt. You can challenge it, or stretch it in a new direction, so long as you are still addressing the key concepts. Thirdly, I need to start thinking about how I'm going to apply these ideas to text and wider world examples. I will consider examples from the text that can fit the prompt, such as characters who imagine the world in a particular way, or contrasting responses to landscape. Something you need to note here is that achieving a high mark with this prompt is not as simple as choosing one of those ideas we spoke about before, and then looking at a few different examples. Your response needs to be more complex than that. You're better off structuring your paragraphs around the ideas, and then finding different examples to fit, than choosing examples to start with, and then trying to make your big ideas seem somehow different when they're really the same. Finally, I'm going to draw this plan out on paper before I start writing. You probably want to ask me now how much planning you should do before you start writing, am I right? Well, sorry, but I don't have a clear answer for you. It differs from person to person. I personally don't do a lot. I just jot down what the big idea and example that is going to go in each paragraph is. But this is because I'm normally pretty good at staying on track. If you struggle to stay on track, or your teacher has criticized your topic centers for being a bit off topic before, that's an indication you need to write out a plan in a little more detail. For this prompt, there are three main points that I want to discuss. First of all, imagination informs how we see physical landscape. We are each limited by our subjective interpretation of the world. For example, the contrasting responses to India by individuals from different backgrounds in a passage to India. Compare colonial versus indigenous attitudes to land in Australia. Second of all, imagination might motivate us to change the landscape from how it is. For example, in a passage to India, colonial desire to mimic landscapes in new places, as seen through characters like Ronnie. Third of all, a conflict between the imagined and physical might result in a negative response from the individual who encounters it. For example, the influence of changes to landscape on residents, incidents of trauma as a result of negative human intervention to a familiar place. Once you have this plan down, you're ready to write. Sometimes this is the worst part. You know everything you're going to say, but somehow that first sentence just isn't coming. Be a bit strategic here. Just get something down on the page, even if it's absolute rubbish, and come back to it later. My first sentence never looks right once I've written a bit more, but in finishing the essay, my writing becomes more fluid and I'm able to rewrite it quite quickly at the end. Something I've left out of this whole plan is vocabulary brainstorming, because ideally that's not something you should do in SACS or the exam. That said, it is a great way to start a practice essay. Once you've looked at the prompt, underline the words that you think you're going to use too frequently in your work, and then brainstorm a list of alternatives. This is not as easy as checking synonyms, although it can help. It requires you actually think about what that word means in the context of the sentence. For example, synonyms will not generate informs as an alternative to shapes, but it could be one within the context of your writing. Other words to replace this would be influences, dictates, and controls, but those all rely on the context you're using them in. I hope this has given you some confidence for approaching prompts. Help yourself out by reading widely and having a solid understanding of the big ideas that imaginative landscape prompts relate to. Other than that, the first few pieces are inevitably the hardest, but it gets easier and easier the more you do. Don't just get something back from your teacher and put it away. Try rewriting essays and handing them back in. This technique allows you to learn from mistakes much faster than you would otherwise. Thanks for watching, and make sure you check out our many other videos on imaginative landscape and your specific text. Catch you next time.